1. Opening. When survival stops being theory, you need to hear this. Because the most powerful survival tool of World War II wasn't a weapon or a bunker or a clever escape plan. It was something far quieter, something so ordinary that most people walk past it today without a second glance. Yet this simple device kept entire families alive while power grids failed, fuel vanished, and global supply chains collapsed overnight. And if you understand how it worked, you'll walk away with a skill you can apply immediately, even in a modern home. Now let me take you back for a moment. Picture a winter night in 1943. The wind pushes through the cracks of an old farmhouse. The shelves in the kitchen are thinning out because the weekly ration coupons no longer stretch as far as they did last month. A single lamp flickers in the corner, not because it's cozy, but because electricity has been unreliable for weeks. Down in the pantry, a few burlap sacks of grain sit untouched. Not because the family forgot about them, but because those calories are locked behind a problem no one talks about anymore. This is where true survival begins. Not with glamorous gear, but with the quiet realization that your life depends on tools that do not rely on grids, engines, or fuel deliveries. Tools that work because you work, and tools that transform scarcity into certainty. Today, we rediscover one of them. 2. The real context. When war dismantled every system families relied on to understand why this tool mattered, you have to step into the reality of the 1940s, where every system you depend on today was fragile or non-existent. Supply ships crossing the Atlantic were sunk without warning. Freight trains were rerouted for military use, leaving civilian shipments delayed for weeks. Coal yards ran dry because fuel was diverted to factories. And in many rural regions, especially in North America, electricity still hadn't reached the average farmhouse. Even in cities, blackouts became routine. Families cooked by candlelight and heated water over wood stoves because modern infrastructure was stretched past its limits. Food, once taken for granted, became unpredictable. Not because people were lazy or unprepared, but because global logistics had simply collapsed under the weight of war. When the system goes down, you suddenly discover that everything you thought was normal life was actually a fragile chain held together by millions of moving parts. And the moment even a few of those parts fail, basic survival shifts back onto your shoulders. That's why wartime families didn't wait for rescue. They built resilience into their daily routines. They trusted tools that didn't need electricity, parts, or fuel. Tools that worked just as reliably in freezing barns and blackout kitchens as they did on a sunny day. And at the center of that resilience was a device so fundamental that without it, thousands of rural households simply would not have made it through the hardest years of the war. 3. The core problem everyone faced. Calories that were locked away during World War II. Governments around the world encouraged families to store whole grains rather than flour. Whole grains last longer, resist insects better, and stay stable through humidity changes. They are one of the safest forms of long-term food security humanity has ever relied on. But there was a problem, one so simple that most modern people forget it entirely. Whole grain cannot feed you unless you can process it. You can have a year's worth of calories sitting safely in sacks, and yet you cannot turn any of it into bread, porridge, or animal feed without breaking each kernel down. That's why historians often refer to whole grain as stored energy, or more accurately, locked energy. It holds the nutrition to keep a family alive through an entire winter. But it is useless without a way to access it every single day. And this was not a small issue. Town mills were overworked, underpowered, or shut down. Electric grinders were rare, and when the grid flickered off, they became dead weight. Even handheld pestles were painfully slow. Families needed something faster, sturdier, and built for daily use. Without it, their entire food supply was nothing more than a promise they couldn't actually eat. This is why the tool we're about to explore wasn't just helpful, it was essential. It unlocked the one resource everyone could still rely on: grain. And in doing so, it became the beating heart of the wartime kitchen economy. 4. The tool revealed the hand-cranked grain mill, not a gadget, but infrastructure. Now that the stage is set, let's finally bring the hero of this story into the light. In thousands of wartime kitchens, from the plains of Kansas to the bomb shelters of rural France, one device sat bolted to a table, a windowsill, or even the edge of a feed bin. It wasn't shiny. It wasn't modern. In fact, it looked painfully ordinary. But it was the single tool that turned raw survival into a daily livable routine. The hand-cranked grain mill. To modern eyes, it seems primitive, almost laughably simple. A cast-iron frame, a turning handle, two steel burrs grinding against one another. But during World War II, it was far more than a tool. It was infrastructure, a self-contained food processing system built entirely on human power. Its genius was in its simplicity. No motor to burn out, no belts to snap, no wiring to fry during a blackout. It turned every rotation of the handle into something families could use immediately. A coarse grind for porridge, a medium crack for livestock feed, a fine flour for daily bread. The same machine handled everything because its designers understood something modern manufacturers often forget. A survival tool must serve many purposes, or it serves none. This is why wartime families trusted it, because when everything else failed, the mill did not. It needed no parts, no fuel, and no grid. It needed only time, grain, and the hands of the person who depended on it. And that made it priceless. 5. The craftsmanship behind it, built from an era where failure was unacceptable. To truly appreciate the value of these mills, you have to understand the philosophy that shaped them. They were born in the tail end of the Great Depression, refined during World War II, and forged by manufacturers who knew they could not afford to build weak equipment. Material shortages, rationed metals, and overstretched factories meant that every product had to last years, often decades, without replacement. That is why the bodies were cast from thick, vibration-absorbing iron that rang with a dull, confident tone when tapped. Proof of density, not hollow shortcuts. The burrs were made from hardened steel, shaped not for speed, but for consistent cutting geometry. Even the adjustment screw was engineered to hold its position through hours of grinding without drifting. But the real brilliance lies in the accessibility. Every surface was designed to be disassembled with basic tools. A single family could clean it, repair it, or realign it without ever calling a technician. There were no sealed motors, no proprietary parts, no fragile components hidden behind plastic cases. Wartime designers assumed the user would be their own mechanic. This design philosophy, durable, transparent, repairable, is something the modern world desperately needs to rediscover, because a tool that can be fully understood by touch alone is a tool that stays with your family for generations. 6. The versatility families relied on, turning more than just wheat into meals. While many people today imagine these mills were only for wheat, the truth is far more impressive. Wartime kitchens rarely had the luxury of sticking to one grain, and families learned to use whatever the land, the garden, or the ration depot could provide. A hand-cranked mill didn't just make flour, it turned corn into hearty meal for both bread and livestock. It cracked barley and rye into nutrient-dense cereal. It ground oats for warm morning porridge. When shortages grew worse, families pushed even further, turning dried peas, chickpeas, beans, roasted roots, and even acorns into usable meals. Each ingredient required a different texture, and the mill delivered all of them. A simple twist adjusted the gap between the steel burrs, transforming a single tool into a universal food processor long before that phrase existed. This versatility wasn't a luxury, it was survival. When the shelves were empty, families turned to their gardens, fields, and forests, and the mill transformed whatever they gathered into the calories they needed. For many households, it became more than equipment. It became a promise. As long as we have grain and this mill, we can eat tomorrow. 7. The complete survival system built around the mill. To understand just how crucial this tool was, you have to picture the entire wartime food ecosystem built around it. In thousands of rural homes, families didn't rely on a grocery store. They relied on a system they engineered themselves. And at the center of it was the hand-cranked mill. Whole grains were stored in galvanized steel bins or thick wooden barrels sealed against moisture. These bins were not decorative. They were life insurance. Inside them sat wheat, rye, barley, oats, and corn. Grains that could remain edible for years, as long as they stayed dry and whole. Nearby, the mill was bolted permanently to a table or workbench, ready to use at a moment's notice. No warm-up time, no setup, no fuss. A few scoops of grain, a handful of muscle, and within minutes, the family had the raw material for bread, porridge, or soup. And once the grain was ground, it moved straight to the next station, a wood-fired stove or a brick oven, often built by the family itself. This three-part system, storage, processing, and cooking, functioned without electricity, without fuel deliveries, and without modern conveniences. It was the wartime version of energy independence. Grain plus, mill plus, fire, ash, survival. And because each part required no external infrastructure, the entire system could function through weeks of blackouts, rail disruptions, or ration shortages. Families who mastered this setup weren't just surviving, many were thriving compared to their neighbors because they had rebuilt a miniature food economy inside their own home. This is what resilience looked like before the word became fashionable. A single tool into a universal food processor long before that phrase existed. This versatility wasn't a luxury. It was survival. When the shelves were empty, families turned to their gardens, fields, and forests, and the mill transformed whatever they gathered into the calories they needed. For many households, it became more than equipment. It became a promise. As long as we have grain and this mill, we can eat tomorrow. 8. How families chose and tested their mills. Choosing a mill wasn't guesswork. Families of the 1930s and 1940s had clear, practical standards because they couldn't afford to gamble on a tool that might fail under pressure. Their testing process was simple but incredibly effective. First came the weight test. A reliable wartime mill felt disproportionately heavy for its size. Cast iron, properly poured and cooled, always carried a quiet density. When tapped, it responded with a deep, confident thud, not a hollow ping. That sound told the user everything they needed to know. This was real metal, not a cheap reproduction. Next was the movement test. The adjustment screw should turn with steady resistance, never loose, never sloppy. Families would spin the handle with no grain in the hopper to check for side-to-side wobble in the main shaft. A slight movement was acceptable, but a noticeable shake meant misalignment or poor craftsmanship. Finally, they inspected the burr plates. Even wear indicated a lifetime of steady use. Chips or cracks meant stress, neglect, or careless casting. And lightweight aluminum mills, those were dismissed immediately. They appeared in later decades, but they were never built for wartime workloads and would wear down or warp under continuous grinding. Families treated these tests seriously because their lives depended on the outcome. Selecting a mill wasn't buying a tool, it was choosing a partner in survival. 9. Restoration the right way. Protecting the cutting geometry. When a family discovered an old mill tucked away in a barn, the temptation to restore it quickly often led to irreversible damage. Many well-meaning people ruined perfectly engineered machines without ever realizing it. The biggest mistake, trying to polish the cutting surfaces until they shined. Wartime burrs were never meant to be smooth. Their effectiveness came from microscopic ridges and angles, tiny geometric features created by machining patterns from the 1930s. Sandblasting or aggressive sharpening destroyed these patterns instantly, turning a high-performance mill into a decorative relic. Proper restoration was far more patient. Rusted parts were soaked in a mild acid solution, usually vinegar or lemon-based mixtures. Brass brushes were used gently, just enough to remove oxidation without disturbing the metal beneath. After neutralizing the acid and drying every part thoroughly, families ran several batches of dry grain through the mill. This grain polishing naturally realigned the burr surfaces far better than any human hand could. External bearings received just a whisper of food-safe oil. Internal components were left dry, exactly as intended, and once the mill was reassembled, it often ran like a machine half its age. This careful approach is the reason so many of these mills still work today. They were never delicate, just misunderstood. 10. Why this tool saved families during the war. To appreciate the true impact of the hand-cranked mill, you must look at the brutal mathematics of wartime survival. In Europe, more civilians died from hunger and malnutrition than from direct combat. Even in the United States, far from the front lines, food rationing squeezed families tighter each year. Sugar, canned goods, meat, and even baking flour became unpredictable. The stores were never empty, but they were never full either. Yet whole grains, stored properly, rarely failed. Wheat berries can last decades. Corn kernels remain edible long after modern packaged foods expire. But without a mill, those grains were nothing more than a silent promise. The mill unlocked that promise. It transformed raw grain into the most essential survival foods: bread, porridge, dumplings, hot cereal, and filler meals that stretched ration coupons further than anyone thought possible. It allowed a family to convert a single sack of wheat into hundreds of nutritious meals. And most importantly, it offered independence. Families no longer had to rely on town mills, which were often overloaded or shut down. They didn't need electricity, gas, or working roads. They didn't need supply trucks. They didn't need permission. In a world where every system was failing, the mill gave them one system that would not. It meant survival was no longer something they hoped for. It was something they could produce with their own hands. 11. Comparing the mill to modern tools, and why modern gear falls short in an age of convenience. It's tempting to assume that modern equipment outperforms anything from the 1930s. But when you compare today's kitchen gadgets to a wartime mill through the lens of resilience, the results are almost shocking. Electric grinders, completely useless during a blackout. Their motors overheat, their burrs dull quickly, and their plastic housings crack under strain. Most can't even handle hard corn or dry beans without choking. Food processors? They rely on delicate blades and fragile gears. If one component fails, the entire machine becomes junk. Modern hand mills. Many are made from lightweight aluminum or thin metal alloys. They look attractive, but were never designed for hours of continuous grinding. They're built for supplementing a kitchen, not sustaining a family. The wartime mill, by contrast, was built for the long haul. It expected hardship. It welcomed heavy grain, grit, and daily use. And because it required no electricity, no spare parts, and no maintenance beyond cleaning, it remained functional long after other tools gave up. When fuel runs out, when motors fail, when the lights don't turn back on, the best modern technology becomes dead weight. But a hand-cranked mill becomes more valuable with every passing day. This isn't nostalgia. It's engineering that still outperforms modern assumptions. 12. Survival lessons from the past. The wisdom we've forgotten. When you study these old tools closely, a deeper lesson reveals itself. One the wartime generation understood instinctively, but modern society often overlooks. True resilience doesn't come from stockpiling gadgets. It comes from mastering simple systems that work no matter what breaks around you. The hand mill teaches that lesson clearly. It shows us that durability matters more than speed, that a slower, human-powered process can be more reliable than a fast, grid-dependent one, that a family with grain, fire, and a reliable mill has more food security than a modern kitchen filled with electric appliances. It also teaches the value of rhythm. Families who used the mill didn't wait for emergencies. They ground grain every morning, building a habit that kept them ready for anything. And when disruptions came, they didn't panic. They simply kept doing what they had always done. This mindset, steady, quiet, and self-sufficient, is something we can bring into our lives today. Whether you live in the countryside or a city apartment, the principle is the same. Build systems that do not collapse when one part fails. Choose tools you can repair. Learn skills that do not vanish when the power goes out. Because when everything modern suddenly stops working, the old ways keep going. 13. Conclusion. A piece of history that still protects us today. When you hold one of these old mills in your hands, you're not just holding cast iron or hardened steel. You're holding the logic of a generation that survived the impossible. A generation that built tools not for convenience, but for continuity. Tools that worked because they had to, and because people trusted them with their lives. If you ever find one buried in a barn corner, sitting forgotten in a shed, or gathering dust in an estate sale, don't walk past it. You are looking at a machine that fed families when power grids failed, when fuel disappeared, and when entire nations struggled to keep their citizens alive. It is a piece of wartime infrastructure, quiet, unglamorous, but proven under pressure harsher than anything most of us have ever faced. And the truth is, its value hasn't faded. We live in a world still vulnerable to disruptions. We rely on long, fragile chains to deliver our food, our power, our comfort. Yet the lesson from the past is simple. When the chain breaks, the simplest systems endure. A sack of grain, a hand mill, and a fire can feed a family. No grid, no fuel delivery, no technology required. This doesn't mean abandoning modern life. It means understanding where real security comes from. It means reclaiming skills and tools that make us less dependent on systems outside our control. It means honoring the wisdom of those who came before us, not as nostalgia, but as a blueprint for resilience. So the next time someone tells you preparedness started with gadgets, generators, and battery packs, remember this. A century ago, families survived with nothing but their hands, their habits, and a tool designed to keep going, no matter what failed around it. And if you've made it this far, then you understand why this matters. Why history isn't just a story, it's a guide. And why some of the most powerful survival tools are the ones the world has forgotten. If this kind of deep practical history resonates with you, make sure you're subscribed to Historia Prime. Because here, we don't just tell stories of the past, we protect the knowledge that once protected us. And one day, it just might do so again.